Then I'm just gonna keep my computer on, Lauren, for you, and I'll host though.
Okay, thank you so much. I'm gonna hang up now. Thanks. All right, we are live tonight with Serene Jones. This event is brought to you by the women's group at VTS, and we are so thankful to have Serene with us. Before we begin, I'm going to introduce you a little bit. Serene Jones is the president of the historic Union Theological Seminary in New York. She's the first woman to head the 180-year-old institution, and she occupies the Johnston Family Chair for Religion and Democracy. She is the past president of the American Academy of Religion. Jones came to Union after 17 years at Yale University, where she was the Titus Street Professor of Theology at the Divinity School and the Chair of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies at Yale University. Jones is the author of several books, including Trauma and Grace. She is a child of the Oklahoma Plains, a daughter of a university president. She's a single mother, a sister, a cancer survivor, a theologian, a minister, a news commentator, a public intellectual, and a devoted teacher. So Serene, thank you so much for being with the VTS community tonight.
Well, thank you for that nice introduction, and it's great to be with you all. And I really appreciate this invitation. And I rarely get a chance to read my own writing. It's always a little bit awkward. I start to read and I say, oh my goodness, I wrote that. Like, oh, I forgot I knew that. And this earlier today, I had a chance to talk with a group of students, and I asked them what part of my book, Call It Grace, I should read from. And one of them suggested that I read a chapter called The Impoverished Soul, which is a chapter about my own growing recognition as a young teenager and then a young woman of the divide of class in America. The whole book is a series of stories from my own life that interweave theological reflection with personal reflection to help students understand that theology isn't just an abstracted enterprise, but actually has real substantive influence on how we make sense of our lives, particularly the most traumatic times in our lives. So I'm going to share with you this story today, and I think it is particularly important because I often talk about white supremacy in the United States, and I tell a story from earlier in the book about coming to grips with my own family's, my own white family's history in Oklahoma with Jim Crow and with the terrible story of a lynching. Lately, I have been thinking a lot about the social construction of white supremacy, the ways in which the church is implicated in that longstanding construction. And in particular, since January 6th, I've been thinking a lot about class in America as well. The two are inextricably tied together. And so I thought this, in indirect ways, speaks to a whole host of issues that circle around us at this very moment in our collective history. So I'll read for about 35, 40 minutes, and hopefully I'll get through most of it's a short chapter, and then we'll have time for some conversation. So I begin with a quote. In the final analysis, poverty means death. Hence, the poverty of the poor is not a call to generous relief action, but a demand that we go and build a different social order. Gustavo Gutierrez, A Theology of Liberation, 1973. His name was Freddie, and I met him at a Sonic drive-in the week after my family moved back to Oklahoma from Dallas in 1974. He had long blonde hair, a charmingly crooked smile, and unstoppable blue eyes. He was the first taste I ever had of pure energy and life. You might say that it's because of him, and not my father, who is a theologian, that I decided to pursue a career in theology. And I have to admit that must be the most unromantic thing ever said about your first boyfriend. But in my case, it's true. 4 years later, having moved east after college and settled into life in an elite liberal Eastern establishment, I realized that he was also these things: white trash, dirt poor, lowlife, career criminal, pothead, social failure, marginal. And I loved him. And some days I still crave watching him ride off on his motorcycle after sheepishly kissing me just before midnight as my parents peeped through the curtains of the living room. Freddie fulfilled my force-fed vision of the Oklahoma Outlaw. He had spent part of his boyhood in a juvenile detention center. He was arrested for breaking and entering and grand larceny the spring of my junior year in high school. He got arrested again for stealing a stereo and was charged with grand larceny a second time the month I finished high school. After his second arrest, Freddie decided to jump probation to avoid the possibility of going to prison and to leave the state, going to work on an oil rig off the coast of Louisiana. It was the spring of 1977, and as he was doing this, I was getting ready for my freshman year at the University of Oklahoma. We were the same age. We'd been in love for 2 whole years, and I was about to lose him to another state, a distant job, and myself to college in another town and another world. We were an odd, rebellious match. Everybody knew it, especially his friends and our family. To his mother, who said she adored me, I was their ticket out of Enid, Oklahoma, and on to better things. I was the daughter of the president of our small town's university. My family went to church and belonged to the country club, but to my parents, he was a troubling teenage moment. They patiently prayed it would pass quickly. A high school dropout, he never belonged to any club or team or congregation. He couldn't imagine it. But that didn't mean he wasn't smart. He was smarter and quicker than most of my high school friends. He wore a leather jacket and put his smarts to more practical uses, coaxing a smile out of me or figuring out how to buy or steal his next meal or put gas in his Harley. Picking up fly-by-night jobs was his other talent. Mostly he laid tar on warehouse roofs or dug sludge out of the ponds around Enid's endless spread of oil rigs. He was also kind. He loved his brother and sister, and he worried endlessly about his mother's drinking and whatever man happened to appear in her life. And when it came to his friends, he freely shared what little he had, although granted, it was mostly for beer or joints. He lived in the back bedroom of his mother's broken down old house on a dirt road in the poorest part of town. The electricity was usually cut off, the kitchen a repulsive mess, but he kept his small room spotless and lit candles and incense to create an enchanting atmosphere. The last time I saw him was on a Friday afternoon in September. He had driven down from Enid to Norman on his Harley to say goodbye to me at college before he hit the highway east to New Orleans. We met in the parking lot behind a local hamburger joint. He didn't want to meet me in the dorm parking lot. He sat on his bike for the whole goodbye, all the more rebel against the ivory-walled college scene. He was awkward and nervous, and after half an hour of quick kisses and stilted chatter, he rode off. There were a few hours of light left, and as I watched him lean his bike to the left and wave as he rounded the corner, I wondered where he'd sleep. Then one Sunday morning in early November, as I was getting dressed for church, I got the call that I had never explicitly expected, but even then had imagined one day might come. Freddie had been killed on a long stretch of Arkansas highway at 2 a.m. that Saturday night. Then came more news. Freddie had been drunk. He'd crossed the center lane and killed people in the oncoming car that he hit. Freddie was dead, and for all intents and purposes, a killer. The shock of his death hit me hard. It actually physically brought me to my knees. My legs gave out under me as I heard his sister's words, and I crumpled like a rag doll to the floor. In a split second, everything that held me together, muscle, bone, sinew, skin, memories, worries, plans, love, all of this lost its ability to hold me up. My mind short-circuited as I fainted, and all I could see was red, blood red, floods of red, numbing red. If a friend hadn't walked by the dorm phone booth I was in, I might have stayed in that crumpled state for hours. And even after she helped me back to my room, the fugue-like state I was in lingered. My capacity to listen, to read, to even make minimal sense of where I was or what I was supposed to be doing, disintegrated. His sister's words, his death, cleaved my insides in half, leaving all of me undone. For the next several days, sleep was the only solace I sought. And even then, my dreams were filled with frantic searches for him, a man who now existed just inches from my touch, but was horrifyingly unreachable. And then on the heels of this numbing shock came overwhelming guilt. The ifs were endless. If I had stayed in Enid with him and not gone to college, maybe he would have never left town. If I had convinced him not to jump probation and just serve his time, maybe he'd been in jail, but still alive. If we had married before I graduated from high school, maybe he'd have been with me at college. I knew all of these were fantasies, but being somehow in my own mind responsible for his death felt better than being powerless in the face of it, especially from the safety of my dorm room. Somehow the thing that divided us, the upward trend of my life and the downward trend of his, had to be the source of his fall. There had always been a wall between us. I knew that. But our youthful stubbornness had refused it and covered it up with illusory futures. It was the mighty divide of class difference. Economically and culturally, the future was mine to bravely dive into headlong, always resurfacing, refreshed and ready for more, with college just the beginning. For him, the world was a headlong dive into deeper and deeper poverty and crime. Never resurfacing, never advancing, finally crashing on a highway far away from home. I could see it all so clearly. When we lay together on his small bed in that back room, our intertwined bodies were two different Americas, pressed together yet worlds apart. In my America, I would live a long, good life. In his America, poverty meant death. That was the simple, brutal, unbearable truth. By the time I went home for his funeral 2 weeks later, the shock had begun to fade as raw grief replaced it. And with that grief, a strange knowledge settled in. I had grown up in a household where we avoided talk of the afterlife in good Calvinist fashion, but suddenly heaven was all I could think about. Not heaven in the sense of some otherworldly, fluffy cloud kingdom where Freddie might be happily hanging out with God. It was much more visceral than that, more real, yet also more nebulous. To me, he wasn't gone. I could feel him alive, close to me, walking near me, whispering in my ear, waiting beyond the next corner to see me. His dead but alive self lingered somewhere, both intimately close and yet distant. I felt the uncanny touch of a living afterlife. So certain was this feeling that if anyone had tried to tell me that there was no life beyond death, I would have slapped them, furious at such an insidious, evil lie. My insides shouted, God would not throw Freddie away like a broken down, useless toy carelessly tossed into the trash bin of nothingness. It was impossible. I also had a profound, if not also desperate certainty that God was with me. About that, I was utterly clear. My church faith held strong on this score. I was wrapped in grace, even if I thought I didn't deserve it and didn't really seek it out. And just as clear to me was the mysterious fact that Freddie was also held in grace, still in his earthen form, dwelling in God and living on, existing. I also felt in my bones, as inexplicable as that may be, that we were held together in the strange reality of God's love, that we remained near to each other, him near me, me near him, both of us enfolded in love. Now, I don't mean this to sound weird, as if I believed his ghost was literally following me around. It was deeper and truer than that. I had never been more certain of anything in my life, and now in his death. Love would not let him go. Love would not let him leave me, nor me him. That strong sense of our divine connection didn't magically relieve the pain of his death. The grip of grief on my heart was tight, nor did it explain why he died as if God had somehow planned it. Instead of that, it opened the door between the finite and the infinite and allowed us to be together, intertwined in our ultimate destiny. I came back to Enid and needed to be near his friends, hoping that their nearness to him and now to me, would somehow confirm this bond that I felt. I called Jimmy, his best friend, to see where they were hanging out after the funeral. Now, my experience with death up to that point had been limited to older adult relatives and included church receptions and family gatherings. In the church world, death was a highly organized affair. As it turned out, in Freddie's world, there was no organized anything. His mother went to the bar, his sister and brother went home, and his friends ended up in Jimmy's living room, the television on with the sound off, the rock band Rush blaring from the stereo, and nobody said much, just drank, which I guess is probably the oldest form of gathering around death. Definitely older than the church. But as I was with them, I began to feel even more pronounced the physical weight of the difference between us. I couldn't explain it, but I saw in their glances, I felt it in their lack of energy, suspected it in their languor. His friends did not dislike me or wish me ill. They simply no longer wanted me around. It had happened so fast, this rupture in our little group, our self-fancied gang. I fought back the urge to run away from that room, to change myself back into someone they wanted to hang out with, if only to blissfully drink with them. Sitting quietly, I racked my brains for clues as to how I could do that. I purposely tried to dress as I had done before heading off to college, wearing jeans and a t-shirt, eliminating any sounds or voices or words that recounted an experience of college, but it was all to no avail. Freddie was dead, and his friends, so romantic, so rebellious, were dead unto me. In America, like anywhere else on the planet, if you are born poor, it dramatically increases the odds that you will die young, that life will kill you before old age does. This class of life, Freddie's class, quite simply kills you. That's the deplorable thing, not the people born into it. I left Jimmy's around 10 and went home to find my father waiting up for me. "Thanks for coming today, Dad," I said to him. I had noticed them at the back of the funeral home. I didn't want to sit with them or be near them. As I started to go up the stairs, my father said, "Wait, Serene, your mother and I are concerned about you. We're very sad about Freddie's death. We know it must be hard for you." The fatherly concern in his voice was clear. "Don't act like you're sad, Dad," I bit back, my anger ready to spew out. "You guys probably are relieved he's dead and out of my life. No longer a threat to your precious daughter's future, blah, blah, blah. You talk about justice and you talk about loving your neighbor all the time. Nice liberal parents. But how many really poor people do you actually know, Dad? Like friends, like a partner, like real people that you've given your heart to, felt their pain." "Exactly none, Dad. You talk about the poor and poverty all the time, yes, but it's an abstraction to you. Economic justice is just a theological idea, an intellectual toy, a policy issue. But Freddie wasn't a policy, he was a living person, and he's dead, and he's dead because he was poor. He never had a chance." Tears were running down my face by then. "And I loved him, Dad. I really, truly loved him." He stepped on the stairs and tried to hug me. "I know, Serene, and he loved you." I shrugged off my dad's hug as if by pushing him away, I could somehow magically catapult myself back to the other side of that class wall that had divided me from Freddie and now from his friends. A wall that college was building higher and higher, brick by brick, book by book. I wanted to destroy something, to get on his motorcycle and drive fast into the night down a deserted road that maybe, I might find myself joining him. I rationally knew I hadn't killed Freddie. But in my connection to his real physical presence, as it slipped out of my reach, the cruelty of my privilege, the privilege of being alive, began to choke me. And I feared that that precious transcendent closeness to him that I felt would begin to fade over time. And I would eventually remember the curse of Freddie's poverty as a little more than a passing childhood nightmare. But that's not how the story went. When James Baldwin wrote, "Love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and yet know we cannot live within," he was right. He was right too when he preached that only this love behind the masks could save us. Youthful though we may have been, Freddie and I took off our masks before we even knew we were wearing them. Loved allowed them to fall away, and for us to touch and to listen and to see each other, and for a shared longing to unfurl between us as we peered into our separate worlds. You don't ever recover from that kind of connection. Its tender, cutting knowledge lingers. When I started reading Latin American liberation theology in seminary many years later, this social movement, which began inside the Catholic Church in South America in the early 60s, gave me new language for what I already knew about class. Gustavo Gutierrez forced me to vividly see and feel, to imagine with great clarity the truth I knew. The vast majority of the Earth's population lives in death-dealing poverty, exploited and oppressed by a capitalist economic system that cares not the least for their well-being. They're mostly invisible, often extinguished, and include all races of people, even poor white people like Freddie. If divine love makes every creature an equal, then anyone who claims to know and love God, Gutierrez says, must commit to stopping this. He also insisted as a theologian that changing this deadly system requires a massive social uprising of those who are most harmed, joined by those willing to let go the privileges that protect them. He calls us to join together. He calls this joining together, when it was grace-filled, solidarity. To be in solidarity was to be bonded with others in their plight, knowing that you're not the same, but committing to sharing a common endeavor. And that endeavor for liberation theology was creating a radical egalitarian economic order, which when translated into egalitarian kingdom on earth. As I was raised on the radically egalitarian theology of the disciples of Christ, this immediately rang true to me. I couldn't help but think of that if Woody Guthrie had written theology, it would look something like this, albeit in an oaky guise. It all seemed so obvious and right, particularly its bracing insistence on economic equality and poverty as the deadliest collective sin of our time. of all times, the collective sin that befell Freddie, cutting short his time, our time. But the part of Gutierrez's theology I felt uneasy about, but understood completely, was his insistence that Christianity's obsession with otherworldly salvation was a massive Christian cop-out. Recalling the classic views of Karl Marx, he describes these beliefs as the opiate of the people. Dreams of heaven's perfections let us off the hook when it comes to taking in the present day, the hell of oppression seriously. Fixating on heaven's afterlife rewards allowed people to accept in-life oppressions because of their false belief that in the next life, they would have things that earthly reality denied them. It made us passive, he insisted, and bled out of people their desire to create that heavenly life on earth. If God's grace means anything at all, he said, it had to make a difference in the here and now, in the land of the living, where the sins of economic injustice were thriving unopposed. Now, I knew from experience that most of what he said was true. I had heard rich and poor people alike in my own Okie world talk about heaven the way he depicts it. The balm that quells the pain of dealing with the sins right in front of you. But my own experience of God's grace in the midst of Freddie's death wasn't like that. It didn't cultivate a view of heaven where Freddie was enjoying the pleasures life had denied him. That never occurred to me. The whole experience was of a different sort altogether. I felt that in the mysterious love of God, the living and the dead existed together in the eternal here and now. Freddie never stopped being Freddie, a young man whose beautiful existence was destroyed. And I never stopped being Serene, the child of relative privilege who was never charged with grand larceny or who never had to steal in order to eat. Held in grace, our connection did not let me off the hook. In fact, quite the opposite. His continued presence kept my anger at his plight constantly fueled, and my desire to fight against it growing ever stronger. It's this fight that eventually sent me to seminary to learn more about the power of theology to challenge social systems. Freddie's life and his death were the compelling force that drove me into a spiritually fired life of social activism. As for Freddie, this vision of his eternal presence ran counter to a world that didn't care if he existed at all, in life or in death. Against the claims of an unjust world, grace insisted on his ultimate value, not in some distant heavenly place, but in the fleshly life he lived, in the dirt of our earthly lives. This vision of divine love didn't drain the living world of value. It illumined its sins and its glories all the more vividly, including the sins of the past that the living want to lop off and forget, preferring instead the lie of false glories. And that brilliant light illumined a powerful truth about our young love. When our masks, mine and Freddie's, came off our faces, they fell apart in our hands. Their construction was flimsy, their material paper thin. To think that the walls that divide us, class, race, gender, sexuality, our different abilities, religions, nations, to think that these might be as flimsy as those masks. Well, it's hard to imagine, isn't it? If we believe those walls belong there, then there they will stand. But if we dare to see them as the flimsy lies that they are, regardless of how sturdy or well defended they might well be, they will fall. As for the presence of Freddie in my life, 5 years after his death, and really because of his death, I was on a plane to, of all places, India. I was headed into poverty, the depths of which I could not imagine, but wanted to experience, having been so moved by Gutierrez's writing. Somehow Gutierrez and Freddie together tapped into the social justice side of my disciples' faith. My social justice activism in college had expanded and grown more global. Loving Freddie theologically gave me the inspiration to go there. However misguided or naive I may have been at the time. And truth be told, even now, more than 40 years later, he's still alive in my hopes for this nation, in my dreams, frozen in time, never more handsome, never more ornery, never more theologically provoking and connected to me. His love, our love, God's love, pushing us forward.
Thank you so much.
So funny, you would think 40 years later, it wouldn't make me tear up, but I guess that is how grief works in our lives and when we truly love. So
Yeah. Well, to Freddie.
To Freddie.
Yeah. Thank you. Speaking of which, you've written a lot about trauma, and you said that's how grief works. And so we're dealing with many griefs and traumas in our nation, and not only with coronavirus, but of racial violence and history of our nation being one that has oppressed many people, especially people of color and women. And so can you talk to us just a little bit about how you see grief and trauma working in our society right now?
Oh my goodness. Well,
and how it connects to Freddie.
Yeah. I mean, I, along with everyone else who's in the conversation this evening, watched with horror as that mob of people attacked the Capitol on January 6th. And it was sort of uncanny to look at that event with such horror and fear and revulsion, but not be able to distance myself from it. My good, liberal, well-educated, seminary president self from it because of Freddie, because he could have been there. I think we know enough about right-wing extremism in this country to know that you can't write it all off as class, that white despair related to white poverty is a significant feature of that right-wing extremism. And while I find that good white liberal people are eager to talk in light of what's happened this year and has been happening for almost 400 years, talk about white supremacy and the construction of Blackness in our nation. It's very hard for white people to step back and look at the construction of whiteness and to see what is driving what's happening in our country right now. And it's a very old story that white people are actors, perpetrators, predators in that story, and have been socialized and formed to be that. And that itself, that process of forming white people into predators, is a traumatic process, and we need to talk about it that way. I don't think anybody is, naturally born cruel and capable of hatred and dismissing and wanting to annihilate entire groups of people. Yeah. The process of becoming that cruel person that is white supremacy, or becoming that numb to the suffering of others, is a process that has to be smashed into you socially. And it has to break you and take you over in order for you to be able to enact it. And that's what it means to become white in America. Now, as for what, we're all going through layer upon layer upon layer, I used an image this afternoon in that all of us have, if you imagine our psychic and social structures, as all of us have cracks and fissures. If you imagine them to be like bones, they've got hairline fractures. But the pressure of this moment is harsher on many people more so than other. And it's turning those cracks and fissures into broken bones. It's breaking people. And from what I know about trauma is that we don't really yet haven't begun to get a sense of what the effects of that are, because when you're in the midst of traumatic, overwhelming, you can't see it for what it is. So I think as the vaccine begins to take effect and we begin to move out of the COVID shutdown, we have pretty hard times ahead of us in terms of the trauma of what has happened at so many different levels sort of come pouring out. It's like the trauma survivor can't tell the story of what's happened until they're safe enough to be able to even name the feelings of what occurred. So we've got some pretty rough times ahead in the church.
Yeah, the work is to come. And as ministers, there's so much that, we're going to be dealing with ourselves, our churches, community members. One thing that you said was that, we must commit to stopping this, all of the injustices, and that we must be part of massive social uprisings. So I'm curious what you're encouraged by. What movements, what's happening right now that are encouraging you that are hopefully changing America?
Oh, I'm encouraged by so much. Black Lives Matters is itself a remarkable movement, and that over the course of the summer, I think what I read in the New York Times a couple of weeks ago, over 20 million people across the nation of all races, generations, abilities, came to the streets. And I think one of the things that's happening in this moment is white people who might otherwise not want to think about it, actually in their own quarantine and their own broken environment, have had their world opened to the reality of white supremacy and racial injustice. And we're at one of those kind of inflection points. As I said today, we're at one of those moments in our nation where nobody, regardless of where you stand, nobody thinks everything's okay.
Right.
Nobody thinks that, so everybody is open for change and knows it's coming, and we're in the middle of it. Now, we may have very different views of where it's going, but the whole thing has been cracked open. And I find so much hope. I know that if I was at VTS, I would find hope in you all, and I found hope in our conversation today, but I find so much hope in the students that come to Union because I know them best. And they come to seminary to study to be ministers and activists and community leaders in the midst of all of this hard stuff. They seek to learn more and to be shaped and formed and have a vision for a better world. Like, as someone in my 60s, it just gives me so much hope that people keep showing up, and that the work ahead of us is something that people still feel called to do. So you give me hope.
Great, thanks. I'm glad that we all do. And so I have another question that just came in. Gutierrez shared that poverty is the result of human causes and that we have made poverty. You shared, born poor, die young. How can we move from the rhetoric of systemic change, especially in the academy and the church, and work toward action and actual systemic change?
I mean, that's a very good question. That is the question, especially for progressive liberal people. And that's one of the things I'm wrestling with in that story is, my argument with my own father, who, and I now am him. So it's not like I'm putting it on him. I was a teenager then, so I could put it all on him. But, when does it not move from being a slogan, or it could even be a deep ethical commitment? I do think those ethical commitments can be very deep, but when does it become reality? And I think that that we have become so isolated around class in our nation. And I was writing about it even back then in his case, that we don't actually have relationships across class divides. And until we're willing to actually leave the comfort of our lives and have profound and deep relationships out of which struggle grows, it's not going to change because it remains a concept. And it's only going to change if we all change it together. It's not going to change just because a few change it. So I remain hopeful. I do think that the weight of capitalism is collapsing on itself. And its own internal fissures are pulling it apart. And as Du Bois said, slavery, the one thing that was most responsible for the construction of capitalism, will ultimately be the thing that destroys it. Mm. That this society of violence and cruelty that is America, that comes out of that legacy, is collapsing on itself.
Yeah, and it seems that we're getting to a breaking point too. I mean, just looking at the data of what the pandemic and the K curve, that the rich are getting richer and the poor are getting poorer, and so that divide is becoming so much more extreme. I think that is one of the fissures, right?
Yeah, the divide is becoming more extreme, and the violence is escalating. I mean, and the stakes are getting higher and higher.
Yeah, more people are becoming desperate.
Yeah, and despairing, and there's desperation can lead to, violence. It could also lead to self-destruction and despair, which we see with this just astronomical levels of suicide.
One more question that I have right here. I love the imagery of the importance of being in relationship with one another without our masks. I'm struggling with how we can go about helping people and ourselves, specifically as ministers or as the church, to see the flimsiness of these walls, of these masks, in our current age of polarization and almost after a year of isolation. And quite literally, we're clinging very tightly to our masks.
I know. That wasn't lost on me. I'm using this image of mask, and I've been wearing a mask. I actually put it on every day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And those literal masks, as we were discussing earlier, are changing the way that we see others and bodies. So how do we get to James Baldwin's work of removing our masks?
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a very good question. And it's one of those things that's going to hit us when we start trying to take off our masks, our literal, protective masks, what that has done to us, and how much more just embodied fear of the other there is in us that the pandemic has created that we have to overcome. And that's part of the trauma that I think we'll be wrestling with. But I think, and this is, this is a personal statement, not a big, vast, systemic statement. But when it comes to taking off your masks and our masks collectively, I think as ministers, you have to be willing to take off your own. Which doesn't mean ministry has to be all about you being vulnerable and telling all your secrets and stories and blah. It's not all about you. That I don't mean to say that at all. But I think in terms of church life, we need to stop buying into the flimsy stories that we tell ourselves about who we are, and actually be more honest about the realities of our lives and who we are. And that's a huge step in the church world.
Yeah. For us to live what we believe, right?
Yeah, or to just not be, not somehow believe in that we're perfect, or that we can be perfect, or that we can somehow be better than others, or that we're not actually quite fragile and yet very resilient. But
yeah. So this next question says, forgive change of subject. I successfully called on Grace to manage compulsive overeating tied to childhood trauma for 18 months. With a move and COVID isolation, I am finding it much harder. Any suggestions?
You and everybody else. I mean, if there's any comfort in Gutierrez's solidarity, I think that everyone is finding whatever that crack or fissure in us might be, that the pressure that threatens to break the bone is there, and it's really bearing down on us. And I think that that being that being gentle on ourselves, and knowing that we have yet to understand what's happened, I think can allow us to be gentler, knowing that the understanding will come, and that we will find ways forward. But apart from that, you're alive, and you're brave enough to ask that question, and you are composed as a self enough to aspire to a different kind of future. And that right there is a miracle in the midst of all of the death that's being dealt to us. So I just want to say, blessings to you.
Thank you. I agree. As you said, it reminded us earlier, we're resilient. Humans are resilient. And so I agree with you on that. So I think we have wrapped up questions from folks out there with a few minutes to spare. So any concluding comments you want to share about theology or seminary education, or anything.
No, my thoughts are with you at VTS, a remarkable school and seminary, and those of you who are graduating this May, blessings upon you. You will always be last year's class and this class. You'll tell your grandchildren, well, we were the COVID classes. And hopefully we'll get to a point in time when that becomes a story we can tell without our voices breaking. That time will come. That time will come. But I know that you are up to the task ahead as much as anyone can be. And I've never been more convinced of the absolute importance of theological education, because you see the vacuousness of our public discourse when it comes to ethical and moral frameworks, and having a way to talk about sort of the existential depth of our social existence together and how tattered it is and what alternatives to that tattered life might look like. To have the capacity to even imagine that, you don't get that in medical school or law school. But building the muscles of imagination and the strength of heart and will to see that different world and yearn for it and describe it and ethically anchor it. And that is the work of seminary education, and to draw on the resources of our tradition and the power of the Spirit and God and Jesus in our midst. I mean, that is the most profound thing needed in our society today. And seminaries are a very precious, fragile, and yet pretty tough place wherein resides those strengths. So what you're doing matters, and it will keep mattering.
Well, thank you so much, Serene, and thank you to Union, and please give our love to Kelly Brown Douglas and all of the Episcopalians who are at Union, and thank you again for being with us.
Thank you so much. Blessings.